costs you slightly more to send or withdraw money on your mobile money transfer platforms. On M-Pesa services, for instance, it is now costing 26 shillings to send between 1,001 shilling and 1,500 shillings, up from 25 shillings. To withdraw a similar amount, it is costing you 28 shillings, up from 27 shillings. This is as a result of the raised excise tax on mobile money transfer fees from 10% to 12%. It will even have more impact on Kenyans who use kerosene for lighting and to fuel their cook stoves. An excise tax on kerosene has been raised from 7.21 shillings a litre to 10 shillings 31 cents, and already the Energy Regulatory Commission has revised the kerosene maximum recommended prices to 87 shillings 20 cents in Nairobi and 88 shillings 42 cents in Mombasa. Let's cross over to Nyeri. We will be crossing over to Nyeri to speak to Martin Munene, who has been following on this story. But before we carry on, even delve into the discussion, let's look at how the situation is likely to change as we cross over into the new financial year. Of course, as I said, that we have already crossed over to the new financial year, bearing in mind that it started on the 1st of July, that is yesterday. And the tax changes, we have to take a look at that, the changes that are based on the budget statement of 2018-2019 financial year, that will make ultimately effect to the economy in the spirit of promoting local manufacturers under the mantra Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich, while introducing the budget statement in Parliament, says that he's introducing tax terms that are supposed to be punitive to ensure that the cheaper imports of products that are locally available are discouraged. Let's look at some of those, in that we have the local steel manufacturers stand to benefit with the raising of import duty from current the previous 25% to now 35% on iron and steel products produced in the region. Next up is textile and footwear imports that will now attract an import duty of the higher of $5 per unit, or 35% of the value. That should then boost the market for local textile and footwear manufacturers. The timber industries have a space to thrive. The wood products from the region will now be taxed at $110, equivalent to 11,000 shillings per metric ton of particle board. A metric ton of plywood will attract more tax at $230, or 23,000 shillings. And now let's start. You may start to prepare to pay higher for imported vegetable oil, that are cheaper than locally produced products. For every metric ton or 415 liters of vegetable oil imported, $500 or 50,000 shillings will be payable to KRA, or 35% of the value, whichever is higher. The assemblers of computers will now have parts they import or purchase locally exempted from tax. This is aimed at encouraging local manufacturing, innovation and job creation to boost food security. The grain storage facilities will become cheaper as equipment for their construction is again tax exempted. The livestock farmers, you have happier days ahead, or is it? The raw materials for animal feeds are now exempted from tax. For cancer patients, they may have it easier after 7 billion shillings was allocated for cancer screening machines, that is, and further 400 million shillings from a cancer to create a cancer institute in the country, as well as to promote early diagnosis and thus boost chances of treatment and recovery. Let's look at those that may have lost with the excise tax measures that were introduced by the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury. If you have a sweet tooth, an excise duty of 20 shillings per kilo of confectionaries and chocolates will be effective as soon as the budget statement is approved. But now, as you said, some of those have already been approved. And the mobile money transfer services like M-Pesa, T-Cash, Airtel Money and Equitel customers will now be charged 12%, up from 10% of every cost of transfer. That is the cash they incur. If you deal in large volume of money, for instance, you will now incur a 0.05% of excise tax for every 500,000 shillings you transfer at a bank or financial provider. Maybe you may want to limit that to just less than that by a shilling. And for instance, if you have been sending or transferring 500,000, you may have to pay 250 shillings as excess tax. And of course, the high-end car owners, that is the SUVs, above 2,500 shillings cc for diesel cars and 3,000 cc for petrol-run automobiles, an excess duty of 30% awaits you when you purchase the next car that you may want to own. And now in studio we have two tax experts. That's your title for the session. We have Osborn Wanyoike from the PwC, and also we have Maurice Oduor, from a senior investment officer at Cyton Investment. Later on, we'll be trying to look at a story that talks about the excess tax that has been raised for kerosene. But first of all, looking at these provisions that are now taking effect, and even if they do not take effect immediately, they will eventually have to if they are not changed by Parliament. When you look at these, does it give you confidence that they will sort of encourage local manufacturing while at the same time raising revenue for the government? Osborn?
Okay, thank you for having me. That's a wide question. Obviously, the government wants to promote the Big Four, and manufacturing is one of the Big Four. Now, having tax regime or using tax is one of the elements. So you've talked about in your introduction the whole issue about protection. If protecting local industries, that's one way of ensuring that local industries are promoted. But then you brought something else. Will it increase tax collection? You see, that now is actually quite a difficult question, because at one time the government needs to spend money to give us services, and at the same time it has to create employment. But from what we've seen so far, the objectives are clear, they are noble. But obviously what we lack and what we need to look out is the implementation of these policies, such that what the government intends is actually passes through implementation. Yeah.
What do you think, Maurice? Will they work to raise the revenue that is collected by KRA? Will they also help the local industry for it to thrive?
I think if you look at the ideas are good, and now the only thing that's remaining is implementation. And if you have good ideas and you fail to implement, just as you didn't have those good ideas. But if you look at all the provision we are seeing, is the money geared towards the Big Four agenda, resuscitating manufacturing sector, promoting agriculture, and also you've seen some elements in health. So all these things we put together, although there are some areas where Kenya will have to pay more than what they used to pay the last fiscal year, but to put all them in totality is geared towards ensuring that we have capability within the country. We promote the local manufacturing, because I remember a time when we used to have Rivertech, we used to have Kikomi. All those nowadays are dead industry, and now all these policies geared with the taxation are geared towards sustaining such sectors, which I think is key for job creation and ensuring that at least we give jobs to our youths in Kenya.
Osborn, there's people who've been asking the question that the finance bill has not been passed into law by the National Assembly, and also it hasn't been assented to by the President, but these measures are already taking place. For instance, when you're transferring money on mobile money transfer, you can already see the change in the amount it costs you to transfer. Maybe you can help our viewers to understand why this is the case and what gives the National Treasury power to do this.
It's the law. What actually happens is that you have a finance bill. A finance bill is the intention of government to raise taxes. The bill is presented before Parliament for debate. The process of debate is first, second, and third reading, and then assenting by the President. In practice, we find that the President assents the bills just before October, just at the end of September. However, the financial year of the government starts from 1st July. The government needs to collect money in order to meet the objectives of the financial year. So in order to kind of close the gap, they have the Provisional Collection Act that gives the minister powers to collect the act while the bill is still going debate. And that's what gives the minister power to collect the taxes even before they are passed into law. However, there's a time period in which the government has to pass the law, or the Parliament has to pass the law. If the Parliament doesn't pass the law, then the taxes are no longer collectible.
That's right. We want to first of all look at a story that was filed by Laura Otieno on the measures that have been already effected to make sure that kerosene costs more, so that we'll get to that story later. But let me just ask this question, because now you see that the mobile money transfer is more expensive, kerosene is more expensive, and actually the reasoning that was used to have now the excise tax on kerosene moved from 7 shillings 31 cents to 31 cents is they are saying that they want to stop adulteration of fuel that is used by motor vehicles. Is this the proper measure? Because at the end of the day, there are Kenyans who rely on kerosene for their fueling, or rather for their lighting, and also to fuel their cook stoves.
I don't think it's a good measure, because if you look at the majority of Kenyans still rely on kerosene for doing a number of things. But now, if what we need to ensure that we have alternative first before we start discouraging these other aspects, because when you go to people in rural area that rely on kerosene, almost 100% do a number of things. If you now make it more expensive, what you are simply doing, you are reducing their disposable income. Reducing their disposable income, it means there's a report that out the other day that most Kenyans are spending less than $1 a day. You reduce that less than $1 a day, it means now you are making their life more miserable. Right. I think as a government, it's good the direction they are taking, yes, but need to ensure that the alternatives are there first before you start discouraging what most Kenyans are using. And
Osborne, you can clearly hear that there are concerns, and even though the margin may look at just 3 shillings, may look small or little, but at the end of the day, it affects the amount of disposable income that these Kenyans have in their pockets. Just to put the question that when you raise the taxation on kerosene, you make it more expensive for that mwananchi who relies on it. What options are you leaving them with in as far as filling their lighting or maybe their cook stoves?
I think the lower cadre Kenyans are left with barely no option, because they rely on this kerosene to do so many things, for cooking and for lighting, for doing a number of things. And if you look at what we were talking during the break, we're talking about, are there alternatives? You look at most Kenyans still cannot even if the gas is available, most of them cannot afford. And again, most of them, when you increase the price for fuel, again on the other side, on the petrol, again it's increased. So again, now they are suffering twice. They suffer on the fuel, they suffer on the fuel. So now their disposable income is effectively reduced for them to be able to sustain their standard of living. That's why you see now people are opting in terms of now Kenyans are forced now to start changing, where do I cut, where do I reduce, so that I be able to carry out my activities. Yeah.
Talking about the reasoning, the official reason, once again, let's revisit this issue that the National Treasury wants to raise, or rather has raised the excise tax so that to condemn or discourage the fuel adulteration. Well, that may work, as you were saying, that it will make that business less attractive. At the end of the day, this is a vice. Maybe it's an offense, maybe it's a crime. And there are better ways of dealing with such a vice or crime instead of punishing that mwananchi who really has so little to spend on their lifestyle.
I mean, it's a catch-22 for government, because as you see, adulterated fuel affects all the diesel engines that are operating, whether it's lorries, generators, and so on and so forth. At the same time, you need the paraffin for heating and cooking, so it's a catch-22. The alternatives, as we said, are critical. But one of the alternatives that must be there is that government must provide services. As my colleague Maurice has said, yes, disposable income has gone down, but are there services commensurate to compensate the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid to meet some of the costs? So if it's to help them, say, now medical, isn't it? Now when they go to the hospital, they don't have to pay for x-rays, or they pay less for x-rays and dialysis and so on and so forth, then that's a compensating issue. But it takes long, isn't it? It will take long for the, for the services to be performed. But that's the theory. The issue that we are having here is, if you look at the list of the things that have gone up, isn't it? They're all indirect taxes. Indirect taxes affect everybody at the same rate. So whether you're rich or poor, excise duty on money transfer is 12%, isn't it? If you use transfers of cash, it's 0.05%. So indirect taxes affect everybody at the same rate, irrespective of your income. And that is why we are saying it's a retrogressive tax, and therefore government must then have to compensate the people who are at the lower level with services, give them a safety net. Because you can imagine the people who are over 65, 70, who are at home. Now, at least now they're being given some handouts, the cash transfers. Now, are we, are we going to increase that? Because they're now going to be affected by some of these tax increases. Those are the critical questions that we need to look into. But at the end of the day, government must take decisive action. If it's adulteration of fuel, you're right, the law must follow its course. Somebody must be doing it. Somebody must be doing it in Kenya, or is it offshore? Catch the person and make it punitive for that person.
And Maurice, yes, there's that question of carrying out, implementing all these taxes. But look at a Kenyan who is earning a salary. At the end of every month, you have to pay as you earn tax. After that, every good you buy at a supermarket, unless it's tax exempted or zero rated, it attracts VAT, value-added tax.
Okay.
At the same time now, you're introducing excess tax that is higher, whether you have now received some disposable income. Let's say you are left with 10,000, you transfer it to M-Pesa. If you want to transfer it to someone else, then it costs you more. Don't you think this is double taxation and it hurts the economy? Again, are there better ways of doing it?
I think if you look at the challenge that we're facing, that the tax provisions are actually affected immediately. They affect people the same way. It's immediate. You feel it the moment it's operationalized. And that's now what we are seeing with the transfer of money in M-Pesa. We are seeing this now with the transfer of money. People that are doing transfer above 500,000. Now that's the thing that we are seeing with VAT. But if you look at it in totality, what are we supposed to do as Kenya? Because all this thing boils down to the level of income where most Kenyans are. Because when you increase now the M-Pesa, the executed M-Pesa from 10 to 12%, it means now for whatever I used to spend 10 shillings the last fiscal year, now I'm supposed to spend 12. At the same time, my salary is just the same way, constant. Yes. Inflation is also eating on part of it. Then when we now put all these things together, and then one of the things that we need to address and to ensure, because now these are affecting now, will people still prefer mobile money transfer as a means of sending money for different purposes? We've seen in the video people talking about now I'll start sending money, putting on an envelope, writing a letter. I'll now resort to to post office, see whether they can still do money transfer. We need to ensure that we've reached a level of 75% in terms of financial inclusion, which was mainly supported by M-Pesa, because Kenya really embraced M-Pesa as a means of money transfer. So to ensure at least that one is protected. At the same time, we need to ensure that at least Kenyans are empowered, they create jobs, at least to improve the living standards, so that at least when taxes increase, there's a level where Kenyans will have to go and compensate so that they maintain their living standard. Yes.
Great. And Osborne, talking about the reviewed import duty, talking about the textile, the steel industry, and of course the ideas or other policies that you would say they intend to protect the local industry. But you and I know that the local industry, the products that you get here are slightly more expensive than what you can get outside the country. And even if you raise the import duty, for instance, for steel from up to 35% now, it's still relatively cheaper. So does it essentially support the industry to grow?
It's a theory. It's a theory, and I would answer your question. I think it's a world trend. It's a global trend, because if you look at the largest economy in the world, the United States, United States, they are saying, protectionism is the way they are going, isn't it? Make America great again. Now we don't know whether Kenya or the East African community is also now thinking along the same lines, that if the largest economy in the world is saying make America great again, isn't it, through protection and increasing of tariffs, we should also do the same. So there are a lot of retaliatory activities on that. But you go to the heart of the question is, what are you protecting? Are you protecting an efficient industry, or are you protecting an inefficient industry? If it's inefficient, why is it inefficient? Is it because the technology that is being used is outdated? Is it the people, the cost structure, maybe the electricity is expensive, or is it the labor that's expensive? Then the government should deal with those things that make it inefficient. But in terms of the theory of protectionism, it really depends on what is their strategy? Why are you protecting it? And how long are you going to protect it? Because you can't protect something forever. And these are theories that have happened many years ago. I mean, Kenya used to do protectionism for the longest time ever. But now it stopped, and then now it looked like, it's going back to that. But the East African community, because import duties are done through the East African community, there's always need to look at what is in the best interest of the East African community, isn't it? If it's textiles, if it's steel, and there are many other items that are in that list of protected, is that in the best interest of employment? Is it going to, as you're saying, increase tax collection? We don't know. But as one analyst said, government must create the environment conducive for an investor. Government should not really interfere in how an investor is efficient or not efficient. You should create an environment. So good roads, good electricity, good labor, and so on and so forth. When you create the environment, then the product should be competitive by itself.
Right.
Isn't it?
Right.
And if it's not competitive, then it should be done away with, because it's not a good allocation of resources. So the theory is there, but the only problem is that you only wait for a whole year or 2 years to actually see the effect of some of these theories or some of these policies that government are putting in place. But if you ask me, we must look at the efficiency of industry.
Yet, talking about import duty, several times, especially that affects the import duty that affects food products, we've seen it scrapped or waived so as to allow for filling of gaps. For instance, last year we have the big debate of sugar importation that the country on May 12th, the National Treasury issued a Gazette notice waiving the import duty on sugar so as to deal with the deficiency that was that time. But you have seen how it has been abused because you've seen the cases saying that the National Treasury is saying that we have at least 920,000 metric tons of sugar that came into the country. The deficiency was just about 300,000, and now we have sort of a glut. So really, when you are forming these policies as tax experts, what mechanisms must you put in place so that if indeed you want to protect your local industries, it works and it's not abused?
I think if you look at trade protectionism, it's an old way of doing business. The world is moving towards globalization. Even the US, it's just a matter of time. Make America great again will change. Where we are you can't look at yourself as Kenya. You look at yourself as East Africa, look at yourself as entire Africa, you look at yourself as a player in the global arena. And the next thing is supposed to ensure that your goods are cost effective, your cost of production is efficient, you must work on the cost of transport, you must work on cost of electricity, and that's now the key area that the government need to spend time on. We've seen, remember the COMESA sugar importation window, which now we ask for time, we given time so that we put our house in order. We went for an extension. Again, when that one expired, again we went for another extension. And you see how we are behaving now currently with the sugar importation. And when you look at it, you ask yourself, even in Kenya, why are we importing sugar? We have, in fact, you can count all sugar companies in almost every region in Kenya. So what we need to ensure that our products are efficient, and our products are competitive enough in the global markets. At the end of the day, how economics works, the prices will recover themselves, and they will move to a level where now the information is efficient, information is better, that now everyone knows Kenya produces the cheapest sugar, and now people start importing from Kenya. When you know that Kenya does not produce the cheapest sugar, it will mean now we'll have to look for alternative elsewhere. And to do that, we need to ensure that there's a conducive environment for doing business, to ensure that the cost structures are very efficient. That's what government should consider as opposed to doing this piecemeal, giving piecemeal policies in terms of let's address electricity, let's address taxation, let's address now the transport system. We need to take all these things in totality and work on the cost structure for our manufacturing.
And so in terms of making sure that the environment is conducive, Osborne, is it purely a move that belongs to the government? Is it their responsibility, or is it something that local industries can also try to work on?
I think we're in the economy together, so we have to work together. So whether it's private sector or government, they must work together. Now, in terms of creating a conducive environment, one, you must ensure that you as a private sector are going to government with your true issues, isn't it? Your true issues being what is ailing the industry. If it's sugar, what is ailing the sugar industry? If it's textile, if it's agriculture, what is ailing that? As private sector, you go to government and say, these are what is ailing us. That's on one side. Number two, on government side, government must say, listen, this is your wish list. My budget is fixed. Or would I say fixed? It's limited, isn't it? I can't spend on everything that you would wish for. So there has to be a balance between, and this is what government actually ends up doing. It's saying, at the end of the day, what is our role as government? My role as government, as any government, should be to make sure that people have food, shelter, and clothing. That's number one. People have security. That's the role of government, isn't it? Once government is able to balance that, and then look at the other issues to do with, the other things to do with helping government to do its work, you need to look at it together with both the private sector and the foreign sector. Not the foreign sector, the private sector.
Private sector. Yeah. Great. As we close this discussion, Maurice, with this now changing excise tax and the taxation, let's talk about, does it affect the inflation in the country?
Yes, it will, because you look at now, especially with the increase in the cost, the prices for kerosene, that one now filter into the inflation directly. Increase in prices for financial services, the transaction also will filter into that. And any other thing that has been done that affects the livelihood of Kenyans will have to filter into inflation. So going forward, we'll see inflation now going up slightly. You've already seen the trend starting from the beginning of the year. We are still operating within the 2.5, 7.5 government targets, but we are likely to see inflation going up now, edging toward the 7.5%.
And finally, Osborne, for you, talking about all these measures that have been taken by the government, we know that the Kenya Revenue Authority has a target of 1.7 trillion shillings, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of financing the 3 trillion budget. And also now the source of revenue, ordinary revenue, so comes to a total of 1.9. There are grants then, but you have a deficit of nearly 500 billion shillings, actually more than 500 billion shillings. With all these measures that have been put in place, excess tax, VAT, import duty, do you think we are able to raise the revenue that KRA requires despite missing the target in the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, the KRA does its best, and we as taxpayers also do our best. But as you rightly say, the deficit will still exist. The revenue collected is not enough, isn't it?
Yep.
Even if you add up whatever debt you have, it's not sufficient. So you have to operate through a budget deficit. The budget deficit goes on to the question you asked, Maurice, on inflation. If your deficit continues increasing, your inflation continues increasing. Now, what should government do? What government should do is actually implement what are really good ideas. I'm sure Maurice will agree that the ideas in the budget policy statement are really good ideas. What we need to is to make sure they're implemented. And if they're hurting the people in the direction that the government does not, then they should stop them. If they're encouraging industry, employment, food and all that, they should actually continue with those ones. But there's need for proper implementation.
Right. Thank you, Osborne and Maurice, for joining us on this discussion about the tax policies that have taken effect as early as yesterday, the 1st of July. And of course, we'll continue until that time that the National Assembly passes the finance bill with changes or without. But clearly, the new prices are already taking effect.